when Dr. Marcus saw her first look at the Genesis planet, the pride on her face, the joy over all the hard work that her son, and the staff, and all the scientists did. Yes, there were sacrifices along the way, but the end result was just amazing. A living, breathing planet capable of supporting whatever life they put on it. Population, food supply issues were no longer going to be an issue. She achieved the ultimate goal, the ultimate dream. Unfortunately, weeks later, her dream would turn into a nightmare when sooner or later she would learn that not only was this beautiful project that she worked so hard on destroyed, but her son died along with it. Now the real question that needs to be asked in all this is, was Project Genesis a success or a failure? That is the subject of this video. That is what I intend to discuss, and I am going to make a couple of points about this video. According to David Marcus, Genesis doesn't work.
I went wrong.
I don't understand.
I'm sorry, sir. Just don't surrender. Genesis doesn't work.
But why doesn't it work?
I used protomatter in the Genesis matrix.
Protomatter. An unstable substance which every ethical scientist in the galaxy has denounced as dangerously unpredictable.
But it was the only way to solve certain problems.
So David's answer is that he used protomatter in the Genesis matrix, which is supposed to be the explanation for why things went crazy on Genesis planet. The problem here is it flies completely against everything that we've learned about Genesis. So I am here today to prove to you that it wasn't the protomatter that destroyed Genesis. Genesis was a perfectly good device, and there were two major events that took place that affected the way that this planet was developed and how the Genesis torpedo was deployed and how it built up the Genesis planet.
Log, stardate 8130.4. Log entry by First Officer Pavel Chekhov. Starship reliant on orbital approach to CT Alpha 6 in connection with Project Genesis. We are continuing our search for a lifeless planet to satisfy the requirement of a test site for the Genesis experiment.
So Reliance's mission is to search for a lifeless body that they can use the Genesis device on. And unfortunately, they orbit what they believe to be SETI Alpha 6, when we all know it was 5. But their sensors detect a reading on their scanners, and they decide to report in to Dr. Marcus, who reminds them that the planet must be barren of life. There can't even be any microbes, microorganisms at all, nothing. Or they're going to have to move on to another planet. So she authorizes them to take a look, and we all know the results of what happens there. Genesis has to have a barren planetoid, or a moon, basically because it'll break down the subatomic structure and reorganize it into life energy, life matter, and it will be equal mass, an equal mass of life energy. It brings a dead energy and turns it into living, breathing energy, which in return creates the Genesis effect, which reanimates the whole planet. Now, phase 1 of the project would be done in a laboratory. Phase 2 would have been conducted in a lifeless underground. And of course, phase 3 was on a planetary scale. Before we get into the reasons why I believe there were two issues with why the Genesis device didn't work properly, we need to take a look at this one little issue regarding Genesis. When Grissom arrived at the Genesis planet, within a few moments they were detecting life forms. The captain was surprised by it, so was Lieutenant Savick, and even David, who was quoted as saying, there shouldn't be any life on this planet. This should be a lifeless planet, which goes against another little issue that we saw recently regarding the Genesis project.
You did all this in a day?
The Matrix formed in a day. The life forms grew later at a substantially accelerated rate.
The Genesis cave The matrix formed in a day. The life forms grew later at a substantially accelerated rate. So when we look at the Genesis planet and all the animals that are evolving at a rapid rate, this was something that was supposed to happen on this planet, because again, going off of the same model that they used in the Genesis cave, which produced the exact same results. Life rapidly growing on the planet. If protomatter is the real reason that the Genesis planet destroyed itself, then we need to have another question asked. How did the Genesis cave survive as long as it did? According to Dr. Marcus, Corps of Engineers dug out the cave. It took them 10 months in spacesuits to tunnel it out, and then they detonated the Genesis device in there in a large cavern, which created the Genesis cave. And that was there for months before the Genesis planet was created. And also, if it is as David says, he injected protomatter into the Genesis matrix, and it was the only way to solve certain problems, then we have to also believe that Dr. Marcus, Carol Marcus, and the rest of her scientist staff were aware of what David had done in the first place. Because again, at the beginning, when Reliant calls Regular One to report that they found some material on what they believe to be SETI Alpha 6, she replied, "There can't be so much as a microbe or the show is off." Meaning that she may have known that if the chemicals and all the elements weren't in the proper place, if there was any slight deviation from the target, it could destroy their work, like what happened on Genesis, which we'll get to in a minute, my 2 reasons for why I believe Genesis worked. But because there was a deviation in the program, we'll get to that in a moment. But again, we have scientists here who are monitoring every step of the project. And you have to assume that when David injected the protomatter into the program, the computers were monitoring it for results as well as scientists. So I do not believe protomatter was the reason Genesis was destroyed. So what went wrong? Why did this amazing project go so bad? Remember, Genesis was supposed to be introduced into a lifeless space body. And what happened was it was introduced to nothing except dead space, a nebula. It had nothing except the material that it was programmed with. That's all it had to go by, and maybe some stuff it drew from Reliant. But beyond that, it had nothing to draw off of. So it had nothing solid to grab onto. So when it started forming the planet, it was forming it from unstable matter. Now that alone may have helped bring about the demise of the planet, but I believe one other thing set things in motion. And the final thing, Spock. When Kirk sent Spock's body off to the Genesis planet had not finished being created yet. As Dr. Marcus would say, the gravitational fields were in flux. It could have affected Spock in so many ways. It obviously did. Not only did it regenerate him, but the planet bonded with Spock. Planets are supposed to age at a very slow rate. Humans, Vulcans, aliens, we all age way faster than planets do anyway. And when this thing regenerated Spock, it bonded with him. So he started aging rapidly because of the effects of the Genesis wave, and the planet, since it bonded with him, aged with him. Every time he had a growing spurt, so did Genesis. That is why when we see Spock at the end of the search for Spock, and the planet is in its last minutes of life, we see Spock's body back to its normal age just before Kirk sent him off to the Genesis planet. Spock regenerated back to his normal age. At the same time, Genesis is on its final minutes before it dies. Protomatter was not the reason Genesis died the way it did. It's the Genesis planet's birth, lack of material to sustain it during its birth, and unknown elements, mainly Spock and his coffin, being introduced into the planet in its final stages of development. Well, thank you for watching my video. I hope that it was informative. I also hope that you enjoyed it. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, your comments. Tell me what you think about this whole little idea of mine about whether or not Genesis was not a flawed project and that just circumstances caused the planet to go bad. Tell me what you think. Let me know. Drop your comments below. And until the next time, my friends, God bless.